coffee to do because I know I got to do it on Monday. Then on Friday, I'm like, oh yeah, I did it on Wednesday. Got to make sure I do it on Friday. But the Wednesday one's always the one I forget. Today I told my wife that I have a completely clear calendar so she can do whatever she wants. I'm like, oh yeah, but from 9 to 10, I have to do a little coffee. I told her that about 12 hours after the fact. I'll tell you all a secret to a happy marriage is to make sure that you have your calendar clearly defined, especially when you both have a lot going on. Because if you don't, there will be friction. All right. Today, I'm going to be discussing fancy plays because I get a lot of emails about the idea of, I think my opponents play like blank, therefore I should in turn... iPad's right here. Let me pull up the thing for you. Give me a second, everyone.
I see my card.
You see Mario Kart?
Yeah.
Can you say hello to everyone while you're here?
Hey, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone.
Are you about to go start school?
Yeah. That's cool. We go do a project?
Come on, James. Come on, hurry.
Yep. You're going to do a project later. Bye. Love you. James has to start school now. He has virtual school. And so, yeah. School's interesting because for kids, you still have to pay for school even though they're not really getting taught. It's kind of a rough thing. That said, we pay. We're happy to. And they do virtual school for 40 minutes a day. Okay, fancy plays. Here we go. We're getting here. Slowly but surely. It was a hectic morning. Essentially, a lot of people think that if my opponents do blank, I can in turn make a different play and then crush them. And that is true if a bunch of things line up. So first things first, you need to know your opponent's strategy. Next, you need to know how your opponent will react to your adjustment. And usually, you don't know either of those two things, and sometimes you only know the first. And I think a lot of people get themselves in trouble because they think they know exactly how their opponents play and also exactly how their opponents will react to various adjustments. And that is usually not true. Now, I understand some of you may have an immense amount of data that will let you know what the player pool on average does wrong, but even then, you're not going to know what your specific opponent does wrong unless they are the stereotypical player in your player pool, right? So you always want to try to figure out if the adjustments you are making are actually accurate or if they are just adjustments you're making for the fun of it because you think that you know way more than you do know. Something a lot of people who really, really like fancy plays, people who do like these fancy plays, they very often think their opponents think like they think, or they think their opponents think like they used to think. And the problem is like, you just don't know. There are like tons of unknowns. And if you approach poker from the idea of, I know all of these unknowns perfectly, you're going to end up making pretty big errors. So I got an email the other day saying, I think my opponents play fundamentally sound before the flop and they follow the charts. Can I do blank and blank and blank and blank and blank in order to try to exploit them? The problem is that if your opponents play fundamentally sound, you're not going to exploit them. However, people do not play fundamentally sound. I don't play fundamentally sound purposefully because I think that you can do a little bit better than fundamentally sound if you adjust. That said, it is important to know the fundamentals. That's why I created this course right up here called Master the Fundamentals. That is part of pokercoaching.com. So definitely check that out if you are a poker coaching member. Is there a way to get a trial of poker coaching? Yes, go to pokercoaching.com and sign up for the free trial membership. It doesn't have all of the content available, but it has some, and it gives you a nice sampling of what we have. But if you are a member of poker coaching at any paying level, you have full access to Master the Fundamentals, and that will let you know fundamentally sound strategy so that you then know how to adjust and where to adjust. So let me discuss a few things that a lot of people think they should do or think they should consider doing. So first thing is the idea of mixing it up before the flop. So this person who sent me the email said that they like to limp before the flop because people don't play well against the limp. And, okay, sure. The problem, though, is that what are they doing wrong against the limp? Are they just limping behind way too wide? Are they raising a ton? Are they raising too small? Are they raising too big? Right? You want to make sure that whatever they are doing wrong, you are playing into that. For example, if you know that people will raise the limp literally every time, don't limp with garbage, right? Because that's going to result in your opponent's calling, or that's going to result in you being out of position with a junky range, right? Instead, you just want to limp with a very strong polarized range. Well, sorry, a very strong linear range that will be perfectly fine if your opponents raise you. What if your opponents are going to limp behind a ton? Well, you definitely don't want to be limping your strong hands then because you want to get money in the pot, and letting your opponents limp behind is not ideal. Could we define what a fancy play is? Isn't getting out of line against a steady player a good move to surprise him? No, because if your opponent is a good, strong, studied player, if they're actually good and strong and studied, they will know what to do against all sorts of various adjustments, right? And I was going to get to this at the end, but essentially fancy plays may work one time, and that's it. Maybe. They may work one time. They're not going to work one time. They may work one time. After that, if your opponents are paying attention, they are going to properly adjust, right? Okay. So the idea of I want to limp to do something is a strategy that will work if you know what your opponents are going to do incorrectly. But I certainly don't know what my opponents are doing incorrectly. The only way you're going to learn this is by experimenting a ton. And if you experiment a ton, the problem is that if you know you are definitively making a play that is worse than the fundamentally sound play, you are losing money every time you make that play. However, you may be able to make it up because your opponents play so poorly against your deviation. And typically, as you deviate more and more and more and more from the game theory optimal strategy, your deviation needs to make more and more and more and more to make it worth it, right? To make it worth the big, grand adjustment you are making. What percentage of the time should someone limp with the top of your range? Never. Basically, that's the answer. You do not want to be limping with much of anything. When I say limp, I mean open limp. You don't want to be open limping with much of anything. Now, again, as a good example of a strong spot to deviate, say there are 3 limpers and you have pocket aces in the hijack seat, right? If you can look and tell that the guy on the button's about to raise because he's stacking up a 10 big blind raise, obviously limp, right? Because you want that player to put in that 10 big blind raise, then have a bunch of people call, and then you can go from there. That's perfectly fine. That's a very obvious exploit because you can see very clearly what is about to happen. Now, if you think the player and the button and the cutoff are just a little bit too aggressive, that's not a justification as limp, because very often if you limp with your aces in the hijack seats and go limp, 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 and you're going to see a 7-way flop with pocket aces, which, it's fine, but it's certainly not ideal. You'd rather more money go in the pot. So something else this person said is, why don't I make large raises? Why don't I raise to 7 big blinds before the flop? People will fold almost every time. The problem is that as you start making it bigger and bigger and bigger, the minimum defense frequency gets driven down lower and lower and lower and lower. And as the minimum defense frequency gets lower and lower and lower, eventually there's some point where the opponents can play literally only pocket 9s and better and ace queen and better, and they're going to be fine. And no one's folding pocket 9s or better and ace queen or better. So that idea of I'm just going to raise large with a wide range is not a good strategy. Next, should I be 4-betting more often? Well, are your opponents 3-betting way too often? Are your opponents going to 3-bet a lot and then fold to a 4-bet, right? These are situations where you want to ask, what do my opponents do wrong? So there's a big difference between just making fancy plays because you think they work across the board compared to making an adjustment because you know your opponent does something incorrectly, right? If you know your particular opponent 3-bets a ton, then you should be 4-betting a lot, assuming they're not just going to 5-bet rip it in a ton, right? So that's important to recognize that you want to know why you are making the plays you're making, not just, I'm going to limp with aces this time because I think it's a good strategy, right? What is minimum defense frequency? Minimum defense frequency can be solved by taking the equation 1 minus the current bet you're facing divided by the current bet you're facing plus all the other money in the pot. Basically divided by all of the players remaining in the pot. I discussed this thoroughly in, do I discuss this in Master of the Fundamentals? I actually don't know if I do. I tried to go really light on this course, light on the math in Master of the Fundamentals, to just give like the actionable strategies. But I discuss it thoroughly at pokercoaching.com, and I discuss it in my book, Mastering Small Stakes, No Limit Hold'em, so check it out. Basically, it determines what percentage of your range you need to defend, and as you're facing bigger and bigger bets, you need to defend less often in order for your opponent to just blindly profit, or to profit with just blind aggression. All right, let's see. Which calculator can you use for poker hand ranges? Equilab is a good one. Kevin, I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you naming all the positions? Small blind, big blind, middle position, early position. What is a micro stake game? I think the idea of micro stakes, small stakes, middle stakes, I think like that terminology is not good. Just say exactly what you're playing, right? That said, small stakes games are not the big ones, right? Really, the main determining factor of stakes is either what player pool does wrong in general or the composition of good players to bad players. What are the highest stakes you play? Depends if the game's good or not. This idea here that Gene says, but like, is it getting out of line against a studied player a good move to surprise him? So essentially what you're trying to do here, or what this logic is that you are going to go to some part of the decision tree, of the game tree, that your opponent does not fully understand. So imagine it like a tree. We're going to start at the bottom. Everyone folds to you. You can raise or fold, right? But you can actually limp. You actually have 3 options. So if people know how to play when you fold, because you're done, and they know how to play when you raise, because they studied that a lot, because that's what everybody else does, but they don't really know how to play when you limp, they're going to play poorly against this side of the decision tree over here, right? The problem is that, first off, you're probably not all that studied on this side of the decision tree either, and also, you're giving up some equity right off the bat to take that side of the decision tree. And the question is, can you overcome that? Because your opponents are going to play so poorly against it. But right here, you already said, your opponent's a studied player. Your opponent's not a fish. Your opponent's going to be able to think. They're good at poker. Against someone who's good at poker, do you really think they're just going to butcher a spot that's not even like that out of line? And the answer is probably not. They're probably just not going to butcher it. Did I get new lighting? No, but I tinkered with the settings, and I think it looks better. I wish it was more in focus, though. Like, you see how... Like, I wish everything behind me was very, very in focus, just like I'm in focus. Not sure if that's possible, though. I actually don't think it is. I figured out I could make the stuff in the back focus, but not me focus then, so it didn't really work so well. Everyone click the like button. Yeah, everyone click the like button. James doing his best Phil Locke impression with the hoodie, LOL. No, he was doing his Jedi impersonation. Oh yeah, what are the highest stakes I play? On a regular basis, I'll be playing $1,000 buy-in tournaments online on random Sundays. Live, 25Ks are about the biggest I'll regularly play if the games are soft. Biggest I've ever played was 100,000 pounds. I bubbled that. That was a lot of fun. I had the aces. Okay. Am I going to play Scoop and World Poker Tour online events? No, I'm in New York City, and it does not seem wise to travel to play those tournaments. Also, it depends on how many people are in the events, right? Like, I'm going to scope out this World Poker Tour event. If it's good, then Party Poker has a $10,000 series coming up that they were going to do in Vegas, but they're not doing in Vegas now, obviously. And if the World Poker Tour events are very good, then those might also be very good. The Poker Masters events were like fine, but probably not worth traveling for, which are comparable $10,000 buy-in tournaments and higher. So I don't know if it's going to be a great tournament or not that justifies the travel. Like if I was sitting at home, I would do it if like I could easily play from New York, but that's not how it works. What should private coaching cost you? Depends on who you are hiring and what they are doing, right? All right, next. Flop strategy. The question here was, should I check raise the flop a ton because people continuation bet too much? Realize that when you start talking about things the opponents do wrong, you are now saying that I'm going to make an adjustment, not a fancy play, right? Like if you know your opponent's continuation bet the flop all the time, and they'll fold to a check raise when they don't have a pair, well then that's fine, right? That's an exploit. That's not a fancy play. And presumably you're doing it based on data. Next thing, reverse tells. Should I use reverse tells? Should I, well, as Plaza says here, act like a fish even though I'm good? Essentially, reverse tells imply you know a lot about what your opponents think. And very rarely will you know a lot about what your opponents think. And what I mean by that is, let's say the general tell is that if people blink a lot, they're bluffing. Let's just pretend that's what I think is the case. If I think that's the case, and there's poker literature out there that says that, hey, maybe I even wrote a book about it. If I think that blinking indicates weakness, well then shouldn't I blink when I have the nuts? Well, it depends. Is my opponent going to think that blinking indicates weakness? Does my opponent even know that? Will my opponent assume that I am so bad that I will be blinking when I am weak and not when I'm strong? Will my opponent make any sort of actual adjustment based on that? And I think the answer is, like, we just can't know about any of these things without a lot of data. Now, if you play against the same players all day, every day, maybe you can start to learn those things. And the thing is that usually you're not playing against the same players on a very, very regular basis. And even if you do, your opponents will adjust and they will learn, unless they're just completely oblivious. The thing is we're not living in the world of completely oblivious poker players anymore. Plaza says, you mean like in Rounders with the guy with the Oreo cookie? Yeah, people don't do that anymore. Nobody's fiddling with an Oreo cookie when they play poker. And if they are, congrats, you found a really good game. I can't remember the last time I've been playing in a high-stakes game against competent opponents and they're like fiddling with stuff in the hand. I mean, some players still shuffle their chips. I think that's a mistake. In my mind, you should not be touching anything besides exactly the chips you're going to bet whenever you are playing in a pot, because you might do subtle things different that you're not even aware of. Whenever you're betting your chips, you sure better make sure you put them in the pot the same way every time. Oh man, I crushed this guy at the World Series once who, whenever he had a good hand, he would put his chips out in a straight line, like, in that direction. Whenever he had a bluff, he would put his chips out sideways, actually like that. He would take them and shuttle them in sideways. And it was so obvious. And I picked this up after 3 iterations, right? And that is absurd. And you don't see that very often. And usually those players go broke really quick. And the thing is that a lot of these players have had time to lose all their money, right? People have been playing pokers for a long period of time. And the bad players they've lost all their money by now, or they've wizened up, or they've moved down to the very smaller stakes games where you get to play against other people who are somewhat equally bad, right? If you're all enjoying this show, click like, click subscribe. I would appreciate it. Then there's the other idea of, should you play the opposite of your overall strategy that your opponents think you're going to use? Now look, if you are fortunate enough to have an image that essentially has a lot of stereotypes associated with it. I'll give you an example. A lot of older people who wear business clothes, they look like a professional. Usually not a professional poker player, a professional business person. Usually these people play a little bit too tight. Okay? So if these people are known to play a little bit too tight and to not bluff and to perhaps overvalue marginal made hands after the flop, okay, I think those stereotypes are actually probably pretty well known. So if those stereotypes are generally pretty well known, then should we, instead of playing tight, play loose? Or, play still kind of tight, but just 3-bet way more often than normal to make our opponents think we have aces, right? And I think the answer is definitely yes. If you are fortunate enough to be one of the players who has these stereotypes, people will have stereotypes about them, and your opponents are not really aware that you are competent. The problem, though, is that these reads, these general stereotypes, if your opponents are competent, should vanish basically immediately. Like if you sit down and you 3-bet literally every hand you play, even if it is only once in orbit, your opponents are going to figure out really fast that, okay, this guy's playing a regular range and he's 3-betting a ton, so he's not a nit anymore. And, you may get away with it for a little while. And that's really the issue with all of these fancy plays and these major grand adjustments, is that they work like one time maybe. And I think a lot of people put a lot of effort into trying to outthink their opponents and outsmart their opponents. Whereas in reality, whenever you are trying to make big adjustments to your overall strategy from the game theory optimal strategy, you're just opening up giant holes in your game that are very easy to be exploited. And if your opponent is playing closer to fundamentally sound than you are, especially if like not even the way that you are, like you're even on things you're not necessarily adjusting to exploit, you're just going to get crushed. And that's usually what happens to these players. You'll find that a lot of players in the small and medium stakes who are actually winners have huge fancy play problems. But almost no one in the high stakes games has fancy play problems. And that's because they realize that you actually win just by playing closer to fundamentally sound than your opponents, assuming they're also trying to play reasonably fundamentally sound. And if your opponent does have any sort of giant hole in their game because they're trying to exploit something that doesn't exist, your strategy will naturally take advantage of it without you even trying to take advantage of it. And that is very, very powerful. Now, the problem with this is that it's actually very hard to learn to play fundamentally sound. There's an app that came out recently called DTO, which is a good app to teach you how to play game theory optimal strategies if you're playing shallow stacked with no payout implications. So when are you playing shallow stacked with no payout implications? Never? Basically never? So you can't just like sit down and try to learn some default strategy because it changes based on all sorts of things, right? And it turns out the game theory optimal strategy when you're playing deep stacked is actually pretty complicated. So you have to get really good at poker, and that is why we made the course, Master the Fundamentals, and also all of the content at pokercoaching.com. Because it's very important to take into account all sorts of things, like is there rake in the hand? That matters, right? If you study the game with no rake, and you're playing a game with rake, you're going to get demolished. Things like, are you playing a tournament with an ante or a tournament without an ante? Turns out just that one big blind more in the pot is very, very relevant. Also, which spots are we studying, right? You can't necessarily say low jack versus cutoff is the same thing as low jack versus button. It's not the same thing. And that's important to realize. You've had some problems comparing DTO to PIO solver. Well, you have to understand that DTO uses probably a slightly different set of preflop ranges. And that's a problem with it as well, right? It assumes the opponent is playing fundamentally sound before the flop, which your opponents are not. Makes a lot of assumptions. The thing is that you have to make sure whatever assumptions you are making are actually correct. And the problem with developing any sort of like system to teach people that is that it assumes the opponent's strategy to be very, very fixed. And it's not. Hate to break it to you. All of your opponents do not play the same way, or they do not play like you think they play, or they do not play like you. They all play very, very differently. And that is why you have to learn to adjust and take advantage of whatever your opponents are actually doing incorrectly, right? And even then, you're not going to know, so you're estimating a lot of the time. But you very often will know, okay, this guy's a little bit too tight, or this guy is not playing the game theory optimal strategy, because almost no one does. And I think you need to learn how to focus on your own strategy, or how to play your own strategy, and know how to adjust on the fly to whatever you see based on that. Yeah, Mauro, I'm not exactly sure of if you find differences in the two programs. I imagine... Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure they solved on DTO. I know you should be using Munker Solver, though. Munker Solver discusses post-flop strategies. It becomes way more in-depth. We actually just got a ton of game theory optimal charts from Munker Solver. Turns out they're a little bit different than the PIO Solver charts, which is relevant. You've heard top players say they don't apply GTO. Well, of course not. Don't play the game theory optimal strategy if your opponents do something wrong. That's common sense. Please use common sense. If you are playing against a perfect game theory optimal robot, well, you're going to lose, but you should also play as close to game theory optimal as you can. If your opponents make mistakes, you should not be playing the game theory optimal strategy, right? Also, if you're playing something like a tournament, if you're playing a poker tournament, you sure better not use the GTO strategy without taking into account the payout implications. I have a chapter in my next book that's coming out soon, Excelling at Tough No Limit Hold'em Games by Vlada. I'm not sure how to say his last name. Vlada is the man when it comes to ICM. And his chapter is going through discussing spots where, like, in some scenarios, you should basically never lead from the big blind, right? Someone raises, you call the big blind. You should never lead, assuming you're trying to play game theory optimal. But if there are ICM payout implications and you're the big stack and the board connects with your range, you should actually lead a ton. Sometimes 100% of the time, which is interesting to be thinking about. And, I mean, in order to get that out of a solver, first off, you have to use Munker Solver again, and you have to go in and put in the payout implications, and it's a bit of a pain. And to learn the quote-unquote GTO strategy for all these scenarios is virtually impossible. Is this a new book? Yes, it's called what's it called? Excelling at Tough No Limit Hold'em Games. Let me show you the cover. I'm basically done with it. Let's see. Books. Excelling at Tough No Limit Hold'em. Here it is. Some coaches you all may know off the top of your head if you watch poker on the internet. We have, Alex Carr. He is the manager, owner, operator of Poker. We have Alexandre Mantovani. His name's Cavalito online. He's a crusher. We have Bert Stevens, Giraffe Ganger. We have John Van Fleet, Ape Styles. We have, where's Vlada? Oh, here's Vlada right here. There we go. We have Rob Tinian, who is, he's won the Sunday Million twice. Bunch of other world-class players. If you're watching this on Instagram, sorry, you can't see the book cover. Anyway, this will be out at some point. This is an old cover. With a slightly different cover now. Close enough. But, anyway, that's coming out soon, and it is a big, big, big in-depth book. So, lots and lots of fun. Poker players seem very bad to you. Well, maybe you've run into some bad ones, or maybe you do not know how to play well. Why do most of them float so wide? Because you should be floating so wide. A little bit of a spoiler here, but Poker's been in business for some number of years now, and they've been profitable literally every year, despite spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on coaching and infrastructure and whatnot. Also, basically no other backing company has been profitable every single year, which is kind of neat to think about. They have a neat structure where they start backing a lot of people at the very small stakes, and inevitably, some of them get good, and they rise up in stakes. And as you rise up, you teach the people below you. And essentially, you help the people. Everyone's helping each other is what it amounts to. They work together to form good communities and they all improve, and some of them rise to the very, very top. Jamie says he used to be in Poker. Awesome. You can say they are class players. They are class players. They are great. So yeah, fancy plays. Look, if you have good data on what your opponents do incorrectly, then it makes sense to adjust across the board. Like if you know your particular opponents and your particular games, let's say continuation bet the flop way too often, then you probably should be doing things like check raise more often or float more often. You just asked earlier, why do the players float so often? Probably because they think their opponent's continuation bet the flop too often, right? And that is different than a fancy play. A fancy play is like, I'm going to make some absurdly grand play for no real reason besides I just want to try to outplay my opponent. But you make money primarily because your opponents play poorly. Not because you play great, but because your opponents play poorly. And that is important to realize. Good question, Gene. Does the old study material from 2015, 2010, or earlier still make sense to study, or are they too old-fashioned and may lead to suboptimal plays? It depends on what you are studying and who you're studying from. Most poker literature by non-Jonathan Little authors from pre-2015-ish is usually based on how people think they should play against their particular player pool at the time. Good example, TJ Cloutier book back in the day. It said if you raise a hand like ace-king and someone 3-bets you, just fold. The reason is because, well, back in the day, when people 3-bet, they had aces and kings only. So it actually could be a very good play to fold ace-king if you raise and get 3-bet. But it's not a good strategy now, that's for sure. What is Pokar? Is Pokar a coaching site? Pokar is a backing site that coaches all of the players that do get backed. Go apply. You need to be not American, because Americans can't play on the reputable online sites. Pokar does not want to have its money locked up in shady sites that may go down at any point in time. They're not trying to give away their money. And you need to have some results. If you're just like a complete unknown player with no results, they're not going to back you because they have the benefit of being very selective. They're also looking for serious players. If you're not looking to devote your life to getting good at poker and rising to the top, then they are not for you. Where can you learn this Jonathan Little strategy? PokerCoaching.com. I have a website. I don't know if you all know it. It's right over there, PokerCoaching.com. Go check out Master the Fundamentals. It's right there in the Courses tab for you. That will get you up to speed so that you can then make full use of all of the rest of the content at PokerCoaching.com. I highly suggest everyone go through the homework. We have many homework examples where I ask you how you play your entire range in all sorts of scenarios, because that is how you learn to play well, and also how to play well in game. It's very important to know how to develop a strategy at the table so that you're playing at least somewhat reasonably well. If you are always just guessing, if you find yourself guessing and just like you really have no clue what you're supposed to do, you're probably messing up. Like whenever I'm playing poker, in any instance, I'm pretty sure I'm either making the best or the second best play in basically every spot. And if you make the best or second best play in essentially every spot, you're going to be fine. You're probably going to be way better than most of your opponents, because a lot of your opponents are just making the worst play in a lot of spots. Do you play your hand category or your range? What if your category is marginal, but you have a range or nut advantage? Blake, it's very important to realize when you have the range advantage, you want to be betting very frequently, straight up across the board. Period. Your hand category doesn't really matter all that much anymore. What matters, the time you want to be playing based on your category is when you lack the range advantage and lack the nut advantage. Then you really want to make sure that you are doing a whole lot of checking is what it amounts to. How much is it to get all of your coaching materials? If you go to pokercoaching.com/premium, it is $99 a month. You get access to everything I have made. All the training videos, all the courses, all the classes, etc., etc., etc. They use HRC and PioSolver to determine the best answer. Depends on what scenario we're discussing. But yes, whenever I do a poker coaching homework webinar, we have one coming up on Monday actually, we always run those through PioSolver to get the reasonable answer. That said, quite often, again, we're not trying to play the game theory optimal strategy. That's not how you win the most money. You have to realize, I'm not trying to teach all of you to win a little bit of money from poker. I'm trying to teach you all to win a ton of money from poker. And you do that by exploiting whatever your opponents do incorrectly. First book I wrote, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1, was essentially built to exploit the common mistakes the players made of the day, which was they played way too tightly. They played way too passively. There was a book that came out right around 2003-ish that taught people to play way too, basically tight aggressive. And that resulted in them giving away lots of small pots that did not belong to them, or that belonged to them. And like in that book, I say you should probably just continuation bet every single time. And that's not the optimal strategy, but back then, people did play way too tightly. And I make it clear that like if your opponents don't fold, don't continuation bet every time, right? But the general player pool back then did play too tightly. So if they're going to just fold every time, that's great. We actually have a chapter by Ape Styles, John Van Fleet, one of the biggest winners in online poker history. He may actually be the biggest now in online tournaments. I'm not sure. He's definitely up there. He has a chapter on continuation betting and defending against continuation bets because he is the master at this. He defends really wide from the blinds, sometimes close to 100% of hands, and profits with them. And how is he doing this? Well, he's learning to play very well against continuation bets. What's the best way to begin at poker? Go get this course, Master the Fundamentals, at pokercoaching.com. Study it. Then you say, should we learn to play sit and goes? I think in general, you should probably play cash games initially, maybe tournaments. Maybe it really doesn't matter what you play as long as you are just playing well. It's important to make sure you are playing well in whatever game that you are playing. 5 of 6 at the final table of a tournament. You have 7.5 blinds to hijack. Short stack to your left of 6.5, so you're basically the same. You jam 9s. Definitely the right play. Payout jump doesn't matter there because you're certainly not just going to sit there and outlast somebody. You'd like to congratulate your Monday study partner, Martin Grapaniak, and fellow poker coaching premium member for taking down 10,000 euros this Sunday in a 10 euro event. Congrats. Very, very nice run, Martin. Alex Fitzgerald's product, Why Ape Styles is Right, is very, very good for big blind defense and rejamming. Yeah, you can jam pretty wide. Do you ever limp pre-flop? Not a ton. I'll limp behind. Now, if someone limps and you can limp behind, that's definitely fine. But if you're very new to poker and you've never played, I would just tell you to play some like really tiny stakes cash games. Put like $50 in an online site, play 1 cent, 2 cent, and just get some experience. Also, study master the fundamentals. Make sure you're not just playing. The thing that a lot of people do wrong is they'll put some money in a site and then they'll just goof off. And then they lose and are wondering like, why am I losing? I'm playing a bunch. Why am I losing? And the answer is you have literally no experience. And I mean, like think about how much experience I have. Think about how much experience any of the random people in the chat have. They probably have, I don't know, 3,000 hours of experience, 10,000 hours of experience. I don't know how many I have, like 50,000, 100,000, I don't even know, a ton. And you have to realize that you are very, 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 very new. And what you need to do when you're first getting started at poker is to study poker and get good at poker, not like mess around and play. And I would tell you to study and get decent at playing fundamentally sound so that you can make reasonable decisions. And then put in some volume. Then see what game even makes sense for your life. Folding pocket 10s in the small blind to an under the gun raise and a cutoff jam. The cutoff is played. Yeah, that's probably fine. When under the gun raise with someone 3-bets, and you have like 10s, jacks, 9s, ace, queen, those hands can just be folded. And in a lot of scenarios, assuming the players are reasonably tight. Let's see. You're heads up with a slight lead and a sit and go. You check back the king high straight on the turn and lose to a river flush. Is that fancy play? Yeah, you should be betting with straights. You'll find that straights are basically always bet. And the reason straights are basically always bet is because when you have a straight, you're usually not blocking pairs, right? Like you'll see some sets and 2 pairs slow played for the game theory optimal strategy, but straights are just like never slow played or rarely slow played. Unless there's like no other potential draws available. But yeah, if there's a flush draw available and you have the straight, you just want to be betting. Don't be checking. So is that fancy play? I mean, you have to ask him, why did you make the play? Were you trying to like be super tricky and trap your opponent? Or you're just like making a bad decision, right? Martin, hello. It was a great experience. Big thanks to me for the best coaching content. Well, you're very welcome. Congrats on the 10,000 score. Only 66 likes. Wow, you all hated today's topic. All right, well, we won't talk about fancy plays anymore. Good to know. Fernando, welcome. You're a huge fan. Glad you're here. There are 3 stacks lower than you, and the person that jammed is a middle stack. I mean, look, whenever you have a hand like pocket 10s, just run it in equal lab, right? If under the gun has a strong range and the jammer has a strong range, pocket 9s is in bad shape. I mean, look, I'll show you how to do this right here so you never have to ask this question again. Get equal lab is completely free. All right, let's give us pocket 10s. What do we think the jammer has when some weird ICM scenario? Jammer's going to have, I don't know, let's just give him a pretty good range, right? Because he's jamming against the under the gun player. I don't know, something like this. Does this look reasonable? Sure. What do you think the opener is going to raise and then call off with? I mean, it's probably going to be really good if we call off too, right? It's going to be like this. Now, obviously, this guy's going to fold sometimes. So whenever we jam and both players call, you see our equity's way in the dumpster, 26% equity, right? If this guy's not in the pot, you see we are 47% equity. So we're either slightly behind plus with a little bit of dead money in the pot, so we're like barely profiting. Chip EV. Now dollar EV, it could be very different because there are payout implications, right? And then if both players call, we're just dead. Well, it's a dead. 25%. It's not a good spot to be in. So that's definitely a scenario where you have a really, really easy fold. Again, if you're watching this on Instagram, you're not seeing Equalab right now. So make sure you watch on YouTube in the future. And click like and click subscribe. I appreciate it. That lets the algorithms know that you like me. And if it doesn't know that you like me, well, it's going to stop showing up. How should you exploit people who always overbet? Depends on the frequency of the overbets, right? Like imagine I sat here and I played only pocket aces, and every time I had aces, I went all in. How do you exploit that? Well, you exploit that by folding a ton, right? However, what if I'm playing 70% of hands and I'm raising to 7x preflop every time? Well, now my range is just all garbage, right? And if my range is all garbage, then you should be playing lots of pots with me. Probably by 3-betting a lot. Now, if you 3-bet a lot, you have to ask, how am I going to respond? Am I going to be just ripping it in on you? Well, in that case, 3-bet top, 15 or 20% of hands, then call off against the jam, if you know I'm absurd. So you see the answer is not just how do you exploit people who overbet a lot, it's how do you exploit people who play in a very, very specific manner, which is what you want to ask yourself. I mean, while it is very nice to categorize people as like a loose aggressive player, a bigger question is how will they play loosely and aggressively? Like what are they going to do that you can take advantage of? Because for example, if I play every hand and I'll call your 3-bet every time, that's very, very different than if I raise and then you 3-bet and I jam every time, right? B. Dahlem, I hate to break it to you, I would definitely not recommend a program like Snap Shove. And the reason is because your options are not all in or fold. If you follow an all in or fold charts, when you have something like less than 12 big blinds, you are making big mistakes. For example, folds down to the player on the button. Okay? Folds down to the player on the button. We're in the big blind. The player in the button min raises, small blind folds. Our options are definitely not all in or fold. And if you follow an all in or fold chart, I don't even know what percentage of hands you get to play. It depends on the stack size. Let's say you get to jam 30% of hands. If you use an option where you can flat call as well, you get to play something like 90% of hands or 85% of hands or something like that. So would you rather play 85% of hands profitably or 30% of hands profitably? Well, you'd certainly rather play 90% of hands profitably. And it turns out that using an all-in or fold chart for something like more than 11 to 12 big blinds is a big mistake. Because even like with 11 big blinds, you're allowed to min raise. If your options are all in or fold, you have to play way tighter than if your options are all in, min raise, or fold. Or perhaps all in, min raise, limp, or fold. There's a book, Modern Poker Theory. There it is right back there behind me. By Michael Acevedo. And it discusses this in depth. And it shows like how much equity you're giving away by using an all in or fold strategy. And it's quite substantial. So, like, while using an all-in or fold strategy is easier, because you just look at a chart and follow it, turns out playing post-flop with shallower stacks is just, like, infinitely more profitable. You all were wondering earlier how Ape Styles is crushing it. He explains it in the book that I have coming out. And the answer is, it's not all-in or fold, that's for sure. So please, 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 if you care about your money, don't follow, like, reshove charts. Following reshove charts is a big mistake. Just because a play is profitable does not mean it is the most profitable option. Third big blind stacks, we have aces in the small blind. Cutoff raises 2 big blinds. We 3-bet to 5.5, both big blind and cutoff call. Flop comes king, queen, 8. Check, big blind jams, cutoff calls. Oh, I still call. Not worried about that. Easy call with aces. Unless they're both like super nitty. Ace 9 of hearts on the button with 19k stack. Playing shallow, under the gun, min raises, cutoff flats. That's a nasty one. This is probably a flat call, honestly. Folding's fine, jamming's fine. It depends on your opponents. Like, I would definitely tell you, if you're trying to learn shallow stacked poker, I would definitely suggest something like DTO over Snap Shove by a mile. Because DTO is at least going to teach you to play post-flop. Now, obviously, if your opponents are going to fold to reshoves too often, then maybe it becomes way more profitable, right? Do you have anything that shows how to make big folds? You probably don't want to be making big folds. Making big folds is bad. Unless your opponent's just a super nit, right? If your opponent's nitty, that's when you should be making big folds. The thing is, when you're making big folds, you don't get good information, and also you are essentially saying that I'm folding basically everything in my range. If you're folding everything in your range, you're going to be really easy to exploit. Opinion on short deck seems like a fad. Every few years, a game comes and goes. Badoogie was the big thing a few years back. Pot Limit Omaha was the big thing a few years before that. Of the games that have kind of like come and gone, Pot Limit Omaha is the only one that's kind of stuck around. Like back in the day, you have to realize, people thought Pot Limit Omaha was going to take over No Limit Hold'em like 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I spent 6 months of my life getting pretty decent at PLO, just in case. And turns out it just became one of the side games, you know? And Other games have come and gone. Badoogie, Badacy, all of these nonsense mixed games. Short deck is kind of like PLO, but I don't think it's going to become bigger than PLO is currently, and PLO is not big to begin with. I mean, like, it's a game. It exists. You can play it. But it's not going to be the main game, in my opinion. What's the best way to read Mastering Small Stakes? Start at the beginning and work your way through it. What's my opinion on Tonka? I do not know. I have not studied Tonka's content. Stud high-low is due to a comeback. Yeah, exactly. What bet sizes should you have on PokerStars for Zoom cash games? Probably something like 30% pots, 30% half pot, 80% pot, something like that. Then you can always scroll up if you want to be making overbets. Make sure you use your mouse wheel. Your mouse wheel here is very, very important whenever you're playing. Am I going to do a podcast with Ben CB? He's not asking me to do a podcast with him. Will James Romero show how to use hand to note define player tendencies with Range Explorer? I don't know. We'll see whenever he makes the content. All right, I have to get going. What do you think about using heads-up displays online? I think it's mandatory for me. I certainly do way better when I have an heads-up display than when I don't. Turns out good players synthesize information better than bad players. Who'd have thought? And when you take away the good player's ability to synthesize information as well, their win rate goes down. So if you're a bad player, I would definitely suggest you play on sites that take away the edge of the good players. And you can take away the edge of the good players in all sorts of ways. You can make the games turbo tournaments. You can make the games have no heads-up displays. Like, for example, PokerStars has made all their games really turbo-y. Or at least the majority of them. And that takes away the edge of good players. Right? Party Poker took away heads-up displays. Takes away the edge of the good players. Why is the mouse wheel important to use bet sizing? Because if you're playing a bunch of tables, you can't be like scrolling over the little tiny thing, clicking 1 bet, 2 bet, 3 bet, 4 bet. You can't be doing stuff like that. You just have to go over there, click 80% pot bet, scroll up 3 times. You know you're 1.2% or 1.2 times pot, and then you're good to go. I mean, this is assuming you're playing multiple tables, right? I mean, the person who asked this question seems like they care about efficiency. And if you care about efficiency, it implies you're trying to be more efficient and play more games and make more money per hour. If you want to make more money per hour, fewer clicks is generally better. Not always, but generally. There's some programs out there that will help you manage your game setup display, like Stack and Tile. What's the other thing called? Something Ninja. I forget what it's called. Anyway, there are a few programs that do this. They don't work on all the sites, so it's like kind of rough if you're playing across multiple sites. But fewer clicks is better. Turns out efficiency is important. That said, sometimes the programs will crash, and then you have like a giant problem. John may not seem like a good fold, but basically you're asking what range do you put someone when they play a specific way. I mean, look, if the player's a nit, yeah, make big folds. Easy example of this, say under the gun raises, you call the big blind with ace 8 suited. Flop comes ace king jack. You check, they bet, you call, turns a 2. You check, they bet, you call, river's a 3. You check, they bet. That ace 8 probably needs to fold. Is that a big fold? Well, it's top pair, it's pretty good. Am I folding ace jack there? Or ace 2 pair there? Like, absolutely not. Sometimes you're going to lose, and that's okay. How many hours a player required to find your win rate? Hours is the wrong question. Hands or tournaments is a much better question, and the answer is it depends on how accurate you want to be. Is there an overlap with small stakes and the new fundamentals course? The fundamentals course is a little bit basic. This course is designed, this one right over here, is designed to get you into poker. If you, like, say you go to pokercoaching.com and the material is just overwhelming because it's too advanced and you don't understand what's being discussed, the fundamentals course is for you. It's not like any sort of super advanced course. It starts off really basic, like the rules of No Limit Hold'em. But obviously it ramps up pretty quickly from there. It's simpler than the book, Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em. It's almost like a guide to help you understand what is going to be discussed in that book and in the challenge or the homework at pokercoaching.com. What do you do when you always get 3-bet pre-flop and post-flop? Do you play tighter? Play tighter, fold less often. There you go. Have I ever worked with Elliot Rowe? A ton. We have a lot of content by Elliot Rowe at pokercoaching.com in the courses section. Can you learn a lot from a sample of 800 tournaments? Depends on how many players are in the tournament. How many hands are required to find your win rate? Depends on how accurate you want it to be, right? Read jonathanlowpoker.com/bankroll. Experiment with variance calculators at pokerdope.com. There they have a variance calculator that will let you see expected variance over X number of hands. All right. That's going to be it for today. I hope you all have a great day. I have to go. I have to relieve my wife. She has to go to work. She's been taking care of James all morning. Enjoy yourself. Have fun. Be nice to someone and make the most of the day. It's Wednesday. It's work day. Get in there. Do good work. I appreciate all of you. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize. Please ask it again Friday, because I'll be here Friday bright and early, 9 a.m. Eastern time for you. If you enjoyed this, click like, click subscribe. If you're not already a member at Poker Coaching, at least go check out the trial. Give me a chance. If you want to get good at poker, check out the trial at pokercoaching.com. It is completely free. And I think you're going to like what you see because we are making players crush the games. And right now is the ideal time. If you ever want to get into online poker especially, or if you plan on playing live poker ever in the future, now is a great time to spend your time studying and getting good. So make use of it.